Strobe Studios presents Michael Helgens and Greg Kilberger in The Watson Files. Coming to you from the ever-impressive Strobe Studios in the heart of America, this is Craig Dahlen. We'll be changing things up a bit tonight. Dr. Watson was unable to be with us, so I've decided to tell you a story myself. This occurred sometime back when we had a bit of a schedule mix-up, and I arrived at Watson's place on the wrong week. Adventure ensued anyway, and I tucked the story away for just such an occasion as this. So, without further ado, I bring you a story I call A Little Cheese with Your Wine.
Come in. Craig? I didn't expect you tonight, but come in and join the party. My goodness, you're all wet. That rain must be really coming down out there.
Well, good evening, Doctor. It sure is. It's raining cats and dogs out there. But I didn't want to miss another one of your exciting stories. It's been quite a while. Didn't we have an appointment?
Let me check my calendar. Here we are. Oh my. Well, I feel a bit foolish. It seems I scheduled this little meeting of my wine tasting club without looking at my date book.
These things happen.
I'm sorry, Craig. Maybe we can try again next week. I'd hate to disappoint these folks. You're welcome to stay for the tasting, though. It's quite a lot of fun. Not to mention, I'd be a poor host indeed if I sent you back out into the terrible weather.
I'd like that. Who are all these people?
Come along. Let's get you out of that wet coat, and I'll introduce you.
Excellent.
Craig, this is Margaret Smith, Culverton's wife. She is the head of the Art Museum's fundraising foundation.
Pleased to meet you.
And you. I do so enjoy most of your chats with Dr. Watson. I listen to them every week. He doesn't leave out any details, does he?
I try to be thorough.
Yes, I'm sure you do. I have only avoided 1 or 2 episodes, but I'm sure you'll forgive me for not wanting to relive Culverton's failings. Not to mention my disgraced father-in-law.
I could see how having a family of criminals and murderers might bother you. How are your husband and the governor getting along in prison?
Please enjoy the party, Mrs. Smith. Mr. Dahlen and I are going to make the rounds.
It was lovely to meet you.
And let's see, next we have, I believe the two of you are already acquainted.
So, Spencer, it's good to see you.
Good evening, Mr. Dahlen. I see that the storm hasn't let up yet and that you still insist on walking here in the rain even though there's a taxi stand quite near your domicile.
Well, the rain bit is quite obvious, but how did you know that I walked all the way here?
Probably because your pant legs are wet on one side and not on the other.
Well played, Watson. It's always a matter of simple deduction, Mr. Dahlen. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'd like to see if I can get my hands on one of those crab puffs I saw carted by a moment ago.
Of course.
And this is Nathan Moran. He's the founder of the Art Institute over on 29th Street.
Moran, as in Colonel Moran?
Yeah, my second cousin, as it turns out. That clan is an unfortunate twig on our family tree, one we should have pruned ages ago. I can only be happy that Mr. Holmes helped to tuck him away, finally.
Boy, Doctor, you sure know how to plan a party.
Oh, come now, Craig. We can't go judging people based on their families.
No offense, Mr. Moran, but the way I see it, the apple doesn't really fall that far from the tree.
Excellent continuation of my metaphor, Mr. Dahlen. In my case, however, I think you'll find that to be quite incorrect.
There sure are a lot of people here.
Quite a lot of people like wine, Craig. There's Mrs. Rothschild over there, and, what is her name? The docent from the Statue of Liberty, you remember?
Gee, Doctor, I'm not sure that this is a very safe place.
Perhaps we should move on to some of the other guests. Here, right this way. I'll introduce you to someone who has no reason to dislike Holmes and myself.
I was beginning to wonder if there were any friendly wine connoisseurs in our fair city.
Craig Dahlen, meet Paul Tabor. He owns a vineyard nearby and has quite a talent for wine tasting.
I didn't know wine tasting required talent. I usually just drink the stuff from a box.
It's important to assess the worth of a wine before you bring it to your table.
I see.
Paul has been a wine judge for several competitions in the area. I'm sure you've run into more than your fair share of terrible wines.
Certainly. Why anyone would attempt to make wine from garlic and potatoes is beyond me, but still people try, and I am made to drink the fruits of their efforts and then deliver the, quite often, unfortunate news that they have failed in some way.
So you think that winemaking should be left to the professionals?
On the contrary, I think that quite a lot of really good wine can be made by people who put the correct effort into the process. But it's not like making beer or soda. It requires precision and a knowledge of chemistry that most people do not bother to obtain before they start fermenting anything they can find in their basements.
That's very interesting.
Indeed, Dr. Watson has, in his infinite love of tormenting me, brought several bottles of what I'm sure are quite abhorrent concoctions for me to comment on this evening.
They were made by some friends of mine. I'd just like to share your opinion with them and help them get better.
We might as well get these bottles out of the way before we get on to proper tasting.
I heartily agree. Mr. Don, would you care to join us?
Certainly.
We'll just get these open. I like to watch Paul drink first to see what kind of face he makes before I let any of this stuff pass my lips. Here we are, Paul. Let's start with this one.
Very well. That's actually not terrible, but I'm afraid there's something a little off. I suspect it's spoiled, unfortunately.
Aw, that's too bad.
You should try a bit, Mr. Dahlen, if only so that you can recognize the taste of wine gone bad.
What's it taste like?
A bit like what I imagine the flavor of a dead mouse to be.
I think I'll pass.
As you wish. What else have you got?
Try this one.
Why, this is, well, good enough to swallow at least. It tastes like honeysuckle, deep red raspberries, and rose petals.
Precisely.
You're like the Holmes of wine drinking, eh?
I suppose I am a bit like Spencer when it comes to tasting wine. Can I have a bit more of that one? I think...
No cause for alarm, folks. The building has an emergency generator that should keep us going if the power stays out.
Looks like the whole block is out.
We should be back on momentarily. Which one would you like to try next, Paul?
Where'd he go?
Paul?
Perhaps he dropped something behind the bar.
Paul? Oh no! Someone call an ambulance!
Is something the matter, Watson?
You could say that. Paul is dead!
All right, no one is leaving until we sort this out. Mr. Dahlen, bar the door.
Mr. Holmes, you know how I feel about being close to these mysteries of yours.
Sorry, Craig, you can't leave until we rule you out as a suspect.
Do you think I might have killed him?
Not likely, but you know my methods. I must consider all of the options.
All right, I'll make sure no one leaves.
We only have just a few minutes until the police arrive and sully up my crime scene, so we had better get to work. What happened, Watson?
He was fine a minute ago, and then the power went out, and when the lights came back on, he was gone. And we found him behind the bar here.
Well, that's not very telling. What was he doing before the lights went out?
He was trying this bottle of wine that came from... I can't seem to remember this bottle.
Where did this wine come from?
Well, most of the bottles are from friends of mine, but this one says it's from the vineyard of Liam Hyde.
Ah, the Hyde Vineyard. They have quite a number of pleasing vintages.
I've not heard of them.
It is a relatively new establishment. They started making wine in 1993, and most of their wines have only just come to be likable.
I see. Now that you mention it, I seem to recall Mr. Tabor talking about them at our last party. They had entered a competition in which he was the judge, and he had given them poor marks, if memory serves.
That might be a motive for murder, I suppose, but I think that we can do better than that, Watson. For example, we have yet to account for this bullet hole in the clock behind the bar, and the not-so-surprisingly similar wound to Mr. Tabor's jacket, and likely, I'm sure, his arm beneath it.
You mean that's not wine on his arm?
Some of it is, but I'm afraid that the rest of it is likely the poor bloke's blood.
And there's blood on my floor? Somebody get my Swiffer.
So, someone shot the wine critic? Watson, I prefer not to consort with criminals. Can you please ask the question so that I can answer it? I am not a criminal. I have heard, Watson, that Mr. Moran has recently encountered quite a large sum of money.
Yes, and he's been most generous with it.
The appearance of a guilty conscience does not account for the robbery by which the ill-gotten goods were gained. What is he talking about?
Give us a minute, I'm sure he'll tell us.
Mr. Moran, you may recall, Watson, recently tripled the number of scholarships that he doles out every year at his own institution.
Yes?
And who do you suppose gets the profits from these tuitions?
Well, I suppose that he would.
So giving out more money and letting a few more people come for free just means that he ends up with more money in his own pockets. Money which, with some creative accounting, ends up properly laundered. As I have said, I have been very generous by allowing students to come to my university for free. But you still launder some money through the system, money which continues to come from a bank in Zurich. How? I mean, this is preposterous. We can come to grips with how I know all of that later. But for now, Watson, I believe you have a question.
I do?
Yes, you wanted to know if someone had shot Mr. Tabor.
Right. So, did they?
Yes, I do not believe that is the cause of death, but they certainly did shoot him. There's not enough blood for him to have been alive very long after he was shot.
Holmes, are you suggesting that 2 people tried to kill Paul?
I've not suggested anything yet, but your deduction is on track. I'm beginning to think that it might have been 3 or maybe even 4 at this point.
How can that be?
In addition to the bullet wound, fired by someone with less than your characteristic skill with a revolver, Watson, there is also the matter of these 2 scorch marks on his tie, the lines of red running down his neck into his shirt, and the accumulation of white powder at the corners of his mouth.
Why, Holmes, you're right.
Of course. Good try, though. So who actually killed the man? What was that, Watson?
Who killed him, Holmes?
3 people are responsible for his death at this point, since we do not know which one got him first. I'm afraid that Dr. Samuelson will have to sort out who was the proverbial early bird. But when Weathers arrives, you should have him take Mr. Hyde.
Why him?
The accumulation of powder at the corner of Mr. Tabor's mouth is a result of the poison slipped into his wine.
But how do you know it was him?
I saw him putting the latter part of the poison in the crab puffs, which he then directed to Mr. Tabor. But I couldn't find the waiter after I ran into you and Mr. Dahlen to stop him.
Wait, you knew someone had poisoned the crab puffs and didn't say anything?
I just now said something about it, Watson, and I believe only now was I sure that it was poison. It could have been more cheese for all I knew at the time.
Should we perhaps suggest that no one else eat the crab puffs?
Right, well, anyway, I believe Mr. Hyde's motive is already understood. You said yourself that Mr. Tabor spoke poorly of Mr. Hyde's vintage at their last meeting.
Jenny, could you clear all the crab puffs and back into the kitchen, please? Who else then?
That will be Mrs. Smith, whose green nail polish seems bespeckled with Mr. Tabor's blood from when she clawed at his neck. I believe that she is responsible for the bullet as well. The gun in her purse must have gone off as evidenced by the bullet wound to her handbag.
Brilliant! But why did she want him dead?
I couldn't say. You'd have to ask her yourself.
Well, Mrs. Smith?
I'm afraid I thought it was Mr. Holmes in the dock.
See, perfectly reasonable explanation.
Holmes? She tried to kill you.
Yes, and she did a pretty poor job of it, I must say. She didn't even go after the right man.
The story of her life, I suppose.
Well, I never.
Nor will you ever again. Say hello to your husband for me. Now, you can also arrest the waiter there. She's responsible for the stun gun damage to Mr. Tabor's tie that could have stopped his heart.
Why would one of the waiters I hired have a stun gun?
I thought it was an actual revolver when I saw him checking his jacket pocket compulsively while pouring wine earlier, but I think upon further inspection you'll find it to be a stunning device.
I didn't mean to, I swear. It's just that I startle easily, and when the power went out, I just had to get the thing in my hand, and it went off by accident.
Fine, that should be easy enough to get away with.
Get away with?
I think that tidies it up, doesn't it, Watson?
I can't believe that you saw all that.
Apparently, Watson sometimes enjoys underselling my abilities.
Come in.
Hello, Doctor. I got a call that you needed me to drop by.
Arrest these men, Max, and the woman, too. They all seem to be involved in the death of this man, and in my house.
Sure. You 3 have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and be used against you in a court of law.
Well, Doctor, this has been quite the unexpected evening.
Yes, and I must apologize for getting you stuck in the middle again.
That's all right. It wasn't so bad this time.
So, you want to start coming along, then?
I don't think I'd say anything like that. In fact, I'm thinking next time we should meet at my place instead.
I'm sure we'll be fine here.
But no one can find us there.
These things seem to have a way of happening anywhere we show up.
I suppose that's true. If it's all the same, I think I'll take it off, though.
Very well. Stop by next week and I'll have a story ready for you.
Sounds great. I can almost hardly wait. Tonight's Watson Files adventure was written by Michael Helgens and directed by Scott Strosahl. Spencer Holmes and Dr. Watson were played by Michael Helgens and Greg Kilberger. Additional voices were provided by Steve Rimpici and Beverly Mead. Until next week, this is Craig Dahlen saying good night from Strobe Studios. No offense, Mr. Moran, but the way I see it, the apple doesn't really fall that far from the tree.
You're not real polite on your part, are you?
Well, I'm supposed to be.
Doing in prison.
I'm supposed to be kind of that way, aren't I?
He's kind of straight up front.
I'm kind of the goofy guy at the party.
There's Mrs. Rothschild.
We were going to list a couple more, and I forgot.
Yes, because you had them.
I know, I put Mrs. Rothschild.
That's a good start.
There's Mrs. Rothschild. And a dude in a hat.
We don't know the last name of the people.
And Phil's brother.
Yeah, we had first names. Like I tried to go back. There was like Jason the mechanic guy.
You know, we can just make up names.
You could just make up names.
Yeah.
There's Mrs. Rothschild and Mr. Henders. And Billy Bob Thornton. Hey, Billy. Craig Dahlen, meet Paul Tabor. He owns a vineyard.
He owns a vineyard? Lumberyard?
He owns a vineyard.
As he said, I have been very generous by allowing students to come to my university for free. They turned French. Son of a Buick. Hold on a second. Guten Tag. As I have said, I have been very generous. No, he's then Brit. Son of a snake. What's German sound like? Nein, actually lieber. Ich bin ein Berliner. As I have said, I have been very generous. No, son of a snake, I lost it altogether.
You're a Nazi.
Nein.
Nein, ach hier, Himmel!